Good afternoon, one more time. We're at session 4, how guardianship and SDM or supported decision-making can coexist. We're very happy to have an amazing panel of speakers today. As a follow-up to the judges panel, we've been talking about some new legislation passed this year, enacting the supported decision-making into law. And there's also been a number of guardianship decisions issued that do not necessarily support guardianship as the appropriate remedy, but rather they refer these individuals for supported decision-making. So many of the advocates of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities argue that the right to dignity and self-determination and access to supported decision-making are stripped away by the plenary nature of Article 17A. When planning for this session, we thought it would be more effective and important to have a balanced discussion on the successful use of and benefits versus the challenges created by both supported decision-making and guardianship when appropriately used. We also thought that it was important to share a family's positive perspective. Positive perspective and on the successful use and supported decision-making, and to have a facilitator here to talk about how SDM can be used. And I think this is going to be really exciting, and how to employ SDM as a guardian when advocating for their siblings. I think that we think guardianship and SDM are mutually exclusive, and I don't think it's necessarily true. And that's why we wanted to bring this panel together to discuss this. So I have the great pleasure of introducing the following panel members who will be sharing their stories with us this afternoon. I will introduce everyone in order of the presentations, and to accommodate for time constraints, I will refer the attendees to the full bios in the program book that we have placed on our online website. You probably have already seen that, so we appreciate that. Okay, we have Halden Bletcher, Senior Attorney, Office of Counsel in the Bureau of Service Delivery at the New York State OPWDD's office. Halden was the primary drafter of the new SDM legislation, and he is also responsible for drafting the regulations that will be implementing the law. Excuse me. We have Patty Paduano, former guardianship coordinator for Saratoga Bridges, who is a current member of the chapter's guardianship committee at Saratoga. And she's also the supported decision-making facilitator working with Michelle Judah, who is the executive director for Parent to Parent of New York State, and Devin Judah, the decision maker and self-advocate. And we're so pleased that he has joined us today. And we have the last person on the panel, but not least, is Samantha Bardwell, who is an Albany Law School class of 2022. She graduates this year, and she's also a Disability Law Research Fellow. So we thank you all for being here. And we thought we'd start off by having Halden talk a little bit about the guardianship and the supported decision-making, and kind of set the background and context for the discussion today.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you, everybody, and thanks for having me. Can you hear me all right? Okay, good. I am really excited to be here and honored to be on a panel with the other folks here. I'm going to have a little PowerPoint presentation. I'm not going to go too long because I want to give room for everybody else to speak. But I thought it might make sense to do a little bit of background. I'm trying to share my screen now. Can everybody see that? Okay. I think some of this will be duplicative of previous presentations for the folks that have been here for the previous presentations, particularly the last one. But I just thought it made sense to talk a little bit about what SDM is for those who are not as familiar, I know many folks here are, but I will say all this from the perspective of OPWDD and how OPWDD came to become interested in SDM and felt that it would make sense for us as an agency to pursue legislation on this. So as many know, supported decision-making is often referred to as a way for people to avoid guardianships. But I think that, as is the context of this discussion, SDM can also, in many cases, provide those who have guardians a framework with which to continue to make some of their own decisions. I say this because I want to emphasize the fact that that OPWDD certainly doesn't see SDM and guardianship as mutually exclusive. I think it is fair and right to say that SDM is a less restrictive alternative to guardianship, but it's not only that. It is a framework by which people can make decisions for themselves, and that can exist in a lot of different contexts. Obviously, this is in contrast to substituted decision making, and guardianship, of course, is a form of that. But there are others in the OPW universe, and I'm sure many here are very familiar with a lot of this stuff. Guardianship is not the only option. There are advanced directives. There's the surrogate decision-making committee. OPWDD's regulations, in some cases, allow for substituted decision-making absent a guardianship. We also have things called the informed consent committees under our regulations. For Willowbrook class members, there's the CAB. And of course, there are also the healthcare decision-making acts, both 1750B and the Public Health Law 29CC. So, SDM can exist in the context of all of these things, but I think it's important to get a little bit of a bird's eye view of what's there. Again, it's often discussed as an alternative to guardianship, and it can be that, but really I see it more as a somewhat of a formalization of what everybody does, which is that we ask our friends and family for advice when we have important decisions, when we're faced with important decisions. And SDM is really that. It's just that with some structure around it, and varying degrees of structure, because SDM itself can take a lot of different forms. Generally, SDM takes the form of an agreement. I'm not going to talk too much about this because I think Devin and Patty and Michelle are in a better position to talk more about the process of creating an SDMA. But I'll say, just preliminarily, that the idea is that an SDMA is crafted at the direction of the individual, the decision maker, with the participation of their chosen supporters. It can cover various areas of that individual's life, depending on what they want or what they don't want. And under the new MHL Article 82, in many cases, the SDMA will be drafted with the assistance of a facilitator. And again, I'll let Patty and Devin talk about that more. But from OPW's perspective, who can SDM help? Well, it can help everyone. Again, this is something we all do. And so really, regardless of disability, the type of disability one might have, the level of disability one might have, SDM can be helpful. Whether or not one has a guardian can be helpful. But from our perspective as an agency, SDM has exists in a place that represents something particularly useful for us as an agency, because we encounter a lot of people who we provide services to, or people that we serve, who are in a position where they either don't have a guardian and can't make decisions for themselves, or can make decisions for themselves, but perhaps don't have a lot of support in making those decisions. We're also consistently confronted with situations where someone may or may not have the ability to make decisions for themselves, but third parties, whether that be a hospital or a doctor's office or a bank or a landlord, simply won't accept the decisions that those people make for themselves. And so SDM can provide a structure in lieu of guardianship in some cases, or in addition to guardianship. And that could be signing plans of service, deciding where they'd like to live, routine consents that I think we're all constantly confronted with in our life nowadays. There's so many forms that we're given to protect another party from liability, and we're constantly asked to sign things like that. So SDM can be really useful in enforcing, as a tool to enforce one's own rights to make decisions. So anyway, I think, I also mentioned here that in some cases, I think it can also, SDM can be the beginning of a process that allows people to become more independent. And that may include in the context of residential settings, right? We have a lot of folks in our service system who live in various forms of congregate settings, whether that be a group home or something, more restrictive than a group home, or even just a shared apartment with a lot of push-in services. And in some cases, SDM can be a route towards more independence and perhaps transitioning out of those more restrictive settings. I use this graphic, as much as I can, because I think it's just useful to think about. Obviously, this is not a qualitative graphic, right? I don't mean to say that protection is bad and autonomy is good. I think that, these are both just different sides of a spectrum, and they're not mutually exclusive. Hence the idea of it being sort of a Venn diagram. But guardianship has the potential to be the most protective structure that can be used, but it isn't always the most effective. Supported decision-making has the potential to be the most autonomy granting structure, but again, it isn't always the most effective. And there are other things, like I've talked about, advanced directives and our regulations, et cetera, that exist somewhere in between. And I put this ombudsman system because this never gets talked about, but in other countries, there are other systems too. I mean, these aren't the only systems in place that exist, right? And the ombudsman system that I'm referring to is mostly the kind that's used in Sweden, which I think is actually probably a pretty good parallel to some of what we're discussing here, where it's not quite full supported decision-making, quote unquote, because there may still be somebody with a level of authority. And that may be pretty parallel to what we're discussing here, where a guardianship can coexist with a supported decision-making agreement. So just want to point out the sort of the scope of things. I have a couple more minutes before I stop, and I just want to say, I was the primary drafter of this act, and so I'm happy to answer questions specific to it, but a big presentation on this would take a long time, so I'm not going to do all that. But I do want to just sort of say a couple of things. The premise behind the act, obviously, one of the things was to offer legislative recognition to SDM as a less restrictive alternative to guardianship. But it was not only to do that. If you look at the final bullet, the law does specifically allow for the use of informal supported decision-making, i.e. without an SDMA or even with an SDMA that's unfacilitated. And I think it's important, and this was brought up in the previous session a little bit, but I think it's important to point out that the law doesn't require that someone has an intellectual or developmental disability in order to use the less formal versions of SDM. I don't know if Tara is still on the call, but I will just give her a little bit of a shout out, because I think it's important to point out that this is available to people who don't have IDD, who don't have an IDD. It's just that, at least as it exists right now, the most formalized version of the law will only be available to people with IDD. And that's simply just a function of the fact that OPWDD was behind this law to a certain extent, and we're responsible for writing regulations for our service population. That being said, there is still opportunity in the law for other agencies to fund similar pilot programs that have been funded for the IDD population, and we certainly encourage that. And there is room in the law for other agencies to promulgate regulations to implement the law for their service populations. But just a couple of important things. There is no typical capacity standard for exploring SDM in the law. The idea is for this to be very open for anybody to explore, because exploring SDM and trying this as an option doesn't mean that guardianship is off the table. It doesn't mean that the other alternatives are off the table. And so certainly didn't want to limit the ability of folks to use SDM, to try SDM, to see if it could work for them. We wanted to create as low a barrier for entry there as possible. I say there's no typical capacity standard because there is still a sort of a basic one, which is that it has to be voluntary, and that the individual has to know that they're entering into an agreement if they choose to enter into an agreement. And that's sort of typical contract, entering into a contract language. But there's no typical capacity standard in the sense that, understanding and appreciating of consequences as one sees in sort of advanced directives and similar things. The law recognizes facilitation as central to this process and encourages that. And, I won't say any more about that, but importantly, the law does create obligations on third parties to honor and recognize decisions that are made in accordance with an SDM if it's a facilitated one. And this is where the law sort of splits in half, right? Where there is an informal version of SDM that's available to everyone, and then a formal version that's only available if an agreement has been facilitated. This will work similarly to a power of attorney or healthcare proxy in the sense that you'll have a document that you can show a third party that allows you to make your own decisions, but it is different than a power of attorney or healthcare proxy in a really fundamental way, of course, which is that it doesn't confer any authority on another person to make decisions. It establishes the authority with the individual themselves. That said, one of the informal powers, so to speak, or the power of an informal arrangement is that supporters have access and they're granted an ability to participate in a lot of decisions where otherwise they may not have been. And I won't go into a lot of the details, but I'm happy to answer questions about the scope of informal SDM as well. And then, of course, liability protections for those third parties who are for whom obligations are created. I really won't go on about this, but because I think everyone has been made aware, but OPWDD is going to promulgate regulations. We're required to. That will primarily be my role, not alone, of course. But really, regulation is important. We felt that to a large extent, regulation needed to be the avenue for a lot of the nuances of this law because we don't know that we're going to get it right away. This is still a relatively new practice, and statutes are hard to amend, and regulations are a little bit easier to change. And so we want to, of course, get it as right as we can from the get-go, but we also want to give ourselves and everyone else some flexibility, and we want to make sure that if we don't get something right, that there's an opportunity to change that. And of course, a big function of the regulations will be implementing it systemically in our system, and of course clarifying and providing as much guidance as we can about how SDM is to be implemented. And I just want to say before I stop that I really want to be available here. My email address is here. Anyone watching this, and I know there are plenty of people on this, OPWDD really wants this to be a transparent process. We try to make our regulation writing processes transparent, but in this case, we especially want it to be. We can't do this well without stakeholder input. And of course, there will be a public comment period when we eventually promulgate regulations, but you don't need to wait to reach out to me for that. I'm working on this right now and will be for the next 6 months and more. So if there are things that need to be in the regulation or questions that you have about what may be going into it, please reach out directly to me, because I'm really happy to hear those concerns and questions. And so that's it.
Thank you. Thanks, Alden. That was great. And maybe there'll be more questions later on, given the time limitations. So the next person that's going to be speaking will be Patty Paduano, is the facilitator for the SDM contract with Devin and Michelle. And Patty's also has a unique. She wore two or three different hats, I think, working at the chapter in the guardianship arena, but also involved with the SDM. So I think this would be a really good time to share your experiences with us as well.
Thanks, Erica. Hi, everyone. I've been working at Saratoga Bridges for over 30 years, and I think probably the majority of that time was a lot of it as the guardianship coordinator for Saratoga Bridges. I've since sort of semi-retired. But back in 2019, I had the opportunity to attend a 2-day training to be a facilitator. This was offered, I believe Tara mentioned this at the last workshop, that a consortium of the New York Alliance for Innovation and Inclusion, the ARC of Westchester, Disability Rights New York, and Hunter College was awarded this 5-year grant. And so I was part of this pilot to go through this training. What the facilitator position will look like moving forward, I don't know, but I can share with you really my experience as a facilitator and a little bit about the training that I went through. Hopefully this will be offered in the future. So what I really learned, through this 2-day training was, how important it really is to get to know the individual who is the decision maker that I was working with, and to really develop a comfortable and trusting relationship with them, and to ensure that they're the ones that are driving the conversation. The facilitation process for me, I worked not only with Devin, but with 2 other individuals over the past couple of years. And it took pretty much close to 10 months or so to really meet. Devin and I met, I would say, about maybe twice a month. That's pretty typical. It may be more so as we get closer to developing the supported decision-making agreement. The pilot project really provided me with a lot of tools, really needed to facilitate the process. It was a very thorough facilitator training manual. It describes in detail within that there, through this model, there are 4 phases to this. The first phase was really to focus on developing a decision-making profile, getting to know Devin, the decision maker. Phase 2 was really then focusing on enlisting supporters, reaching out to them, people that are in Devin's life and the other people that I worked with, to really identify for themselves people in their lives that they can trust, and that moving forward, they can support them in major decisions. Phase 3 was really focused on negotiating the agreement. What is it going to look like? Going over this with Devin, several times, changes that needed to be made from that. And then the 4th phase is the actual signing of the agreement itself. And it was really a celebration. I mean, that's kind of how we define it. It was a supported decision-making agreement celebration, because it was a lot of work that Devin did along with my support for a number of months before we got to this actual agreement signing. I was provided with a lot of specific documents to make the facilitation process go very smoothly and to kind of stay on track. There's a number of different worksheets that we worked on, really kind of identifying, and for Devin to really explore, what decisions for him that he wanted to reach out to someone that he trusted, a supporter, to help him, work on some of those decisions, or to assist him in making some big life decisions. What type of support did he want from those supporters? Who is going to support him in those areas, and how does he want to receive the support? Throughout the whole process, the pilot provided me as a facilitator with a lot of cheat sheets, if you will, to kind of encourage conversation. This is not something that I, would come up with myself. It was a real nice guide to help the facilitation process go really smoothly. You know, and the process not only involved working directly with Devin and other decision makers, but it also included meetings with the people that the decision maker has chosen to support. You know, Devin and I worked for many months before we even got to the point where supporters were chosen, and he felt very comfortable with who he has chosen. You know, we set up meetings, you know, and the unfortunate thing for Devin and I is that when we first met, we were meeting in person, and then COVID hit. So when COVID hit, we moved to Zoom. We were all getting to learn how to use Zoom at that time. It's funny how it comes second nature now, but at the time, you know, we got his supporters in Zoom meetings. And he could talk more about who he has chosen as his supporters, but not everyone lived locally. So it worked. It really worked for us, and it worked for Devin. But aside from the fact that there were supporters that he chose to help him with or assist when he wanted with big life decisions, each of those supporters had a very specific role. It wasn't a general supporter that would help with all decisions. You know, Devin decided there are a number of different areas where one particular supporter would help with maybe some healthcare decisions. And there was another supporter that, you know, as Devin could talk more about his educational future, you know, he reached out to supporters that were in the education field that he knew that he could count on to help if there was a big decision he needed to make. So it's very tailored. The agreement at the end of the day, when we actually signed it, was very, very much tailored to what Devin wanted. And, you know, what I realized really through the whole facilitation process, you know, not only with Devin, but also with the two other individuals that I supported, you know, there is not a one size fits all with this. There are a number of key areas of decision-making that myself and the decision maker explore together. And those areas include, and the way that the pilot worked, it kind of divided those different big decisions in various areas, such as health, work, money, education, housing, services, access to services, and relationships. And each decision maker chose the areas that they wanted support in. You know, Devin made it very clear, and again, you can talk about that throughout the whole facilitation process, you know, he was very, very much okay with making decisions on his own in a lot of areas. And then there were other areas that he thought that, you know, well, I might need some support in some of the big ones, and he can talk about that. So not every single area that was really focused on in the pilot, you don't always have to have a supporter in every single one of those. You pick and choose what's important to you and what you want. And the beauty of this too is that along the way with this agreement is that changes can be made at any time. And again, this is based on what Devin's, you know, life changes, things happen in life. And there may be an area that he was looking for a supporter in, say maybe in education, but then he's out of the education system at one time or another, you know, in the next number of years. He may not need that supporter anymore for that. So, and again, he can talk about that, and certainly Michelle, as his mom and supporter, one of his supporters, can talk more about that. You know, I also really discovered through this process that, you know, as being a guardianship coordinator for many years and a committee member now, that, you know, we as a committee are very much similar to the supporters in the supported decision-making, I feel. You know, as a committee, you know, anytime there's a particular decision or big decision that needs to be made, whether it be a consent for some kind of surgery, or an individual is moving, or there may be an interest in moving somewhere else, we always, and I'm sure many of you who are, you know, either guardianship coordinators or committee members, we all include all the time the individual that we're guardian for in any big decision. We are their supporters. And I think that this really, as supporters in supported decision-making and in guardianship as a guardianship committee member, they kind of go hand in hand, very similar. Before, Devin was referred to me, in regards to making the decision to move forward with this, Michelle and Devin can certainly talk about it, is that, they attended some, workshops on this. There was a lot of discussion regarding, even before he came to me, as his facilitator, he had to decide whether or not he wanted to move forward with this process. And even if halfway through, if it wasn't something that he wanted, he could have stopped it at any time if he wanted to. Every decision maker has very unique circumstances. And, for Devin, he has a fabulous support network, as I discovered facilitating with him. And that, whereas the other individuals that I did this with, had a few very close and tight-knit family members and friends. With Devin, he has 11 supporters through this process. And all of them are just wonderful, wonderful people and participated in the actual signing agreement. So it's important to say, though, too, that supporters are not decision makers. They are individuals trusted by the decision maker to assist them in important decision making. I would hope that as we move forward and with, legislation and how the regulations are going to look, that not only the training that I received as facilitator, but the process going forward, continues in that way. Yes, it does take a lot longer, but I think there's a reason for it to take that long. It's not something that you can rush through. People can change their mind, and we not only, as I said, meet with the decision maker, we also meet together. Both Deb and I met with his supporters throughout this process too, as well. So, so maybe, at this point I would, hand it over to, to Devin and Michelle, and I can certainly, throw in some questions too as well and comments as we move forward.
I just wanted to thank you, Patty, and
Sure.
yeah, we appreciate it. So, Michelle, would you like to start, or do you think Devin would like to start?
I think, Devin, we were planning on you starting, right? So
Okay,
you might have been deferring to me, which is very gentlemanly of you, but if you'd like to take it away and comment on anything that you were thinking about when, Patty was talking, or anything that you'd like to share with folks, we'd love to hear it.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name's Devin. I went to a conference like about supportive decision making. I didn't know what it was until I went with my mom and my dad. So what Patty was saying is that I have 11 wonderful supporters, and one about healthcare. So my brother and my godmother are both in the health field, so I mostly pick them as my supporters. And my mom has a big role that she's my mother and she's a supporter, where she's in money management. And what Patty was also saying about education, that I have a cousin and an uncle and aunt that are in the education field. Yes.
So you gave a lot of thought, right, Deb, to who was like in your circle, like how, like was it easy or was it hard when you were thinking about the different types of decisions that Patty was asking you about, and then who you might, did you want support and who might support you? Was it a little overwhelming at first? Was it easy? How did you find the experience?
It was actually hard for me because I didn't know what supporters would fit into what box. So it took me a while to figure it out, but I had to think long and hard to decide who I wanted them to be my supporters.
And it's interesting, Devin, when you and I first started meeting, you were finishing up your high school education, and you were moving towards, graduation, and, there were some big decisions that were coming your way that you shared with me as to what direction you wanted to take. So, and you can certainly talk about where you are now versus, where you were. I mean, I think you were more concerned about passing your exams at that time, because that was your focus, and getting to graduation. So it was really, compared to today and where you are today.
I'm currently enrolled at Schenectady County Community College. I'm trying to get my associate's degree in culinary arts. I went to BOCES for 2 years for culinary, but I didn't know what college I wanted to go to until I took 3 tours of SUNY Schenectady to get trying to hopefully get my associate's degree in culinary, so I can own my own food truck.
That's excellent. Devin, I'm going to throw you a little curveball here. We didn't talk about this, so we'll see how you do. And if you don't have anything that comes to mind, just say that you don't, that's fine. But like, you were coming to all your IEP meetings at school, and I'm wondering if you can kind of remember back to how it felt. Like, was it different, the process that you were engaging with Patty, as opposed to like the process of like being involved in your school meetings?
Yeah. It was a massive change meeting with Patty in the IEP meeting, because for my IEP meetings, everybody was making my own decisions. But meeting with Patty, I'm taking a step forward to having me make my own decisions.
Yeah, and you've made another big decision just recently. What is that one that you want to share? And was I a fan of it completely? Go ahead and tell the story.
I don't remember.
Where are you living?
Oh, I am living in Albany with another roommate of mine. It's easier for me to live there because I can take the bus to go to college, but my mom was not a big fan of me moving to Albany. And now she's very comfortable.
Yeah, I'm getting there. All right. Do you want me to tell a little bit of my story, Devin? Okay. All right. Thanks for sharing all of that with us. And nice to be here with all of you. And boy, as a mom, boy, I'm so proud of him for being able to do this and talk to so many people here today. So, as a parent, and I'm here primarily as a parent, Erica, thanks for mentioning. I am also the executive director of Parent to Parent of New York State. And we do have an opportunity to talk to a lot of families about, their concerns about how decisions are going to be made as their kids are approaching 18 and even beyond. And then as parents are aging, the worries as to what's going to happen. So I talked to a lot of families, but obviously was experiencing it personally with Devin. And I knew about the time that we started inviting him to his IEP meetings. And I agree, he was a person at the table, but didn't really have much of a say at that table. And I think about what that experience was to just bring him into something like that, where he was, not prepared at all, and all of a sudden was an equal member with all these professionals around him. It must have been really, really overwhelming. And I knew at that time, thinking forward, that guardianship was not going to be, the right thing, that we just could not wrap our minds around seeking a guardianship for Devin. He has a lot to say and a lot to offer and a lot of thoughts about what he wants to do. And we knew that wasn't right, but I also had no idea what was right, because I knew long-term, Devin being unsupported without any structure around how to make decisions was also going to be very problematic. He does, he has some, challenges that he, is learning how to deal with on a daily basis. And, some of that planning and safety and judgment and managing his money, the types of challenges that you might expect somebody, has who is receiving services through Office for People with Developmental Disabilities. So it's not to say, as wonderful as he's able to, do this type of thing, there were still worries that we had as a parent. And then it really came to light when he had to make a medical decision towards the end of high school. It was regarding a dental surgery, wasn't a life or death type of thing, but they were saying, he's the one who's going to need to go through it. It's a painful surgery. He has to decide. And, we were taking him to, what we felt were the best specialists. He had been really sick as a child. I had spent most of my life like keeping him alive. So this idea of like turning him over was really hard for me as a parent. And I realized like they're right. He's the one who's going to go through this and he has to decide if he wants to. And he decided not to. And that probably is not the decision I would have made if it were me. But that was the first time I realized he's not me. And I need to find a way to kind of make room. So all of these things were going on at the same time. And that's when we started hearing about supported decision making. And it really sounded to be like this could be really, really, really great. Because I knew that he will always have the support of his dad and myself, and he has a brother who's 6 years older. I knew that we were always going to be there for him. But there was a limit that we weren't going to always be able to be there for him. And so I was really always worried about what would happen, when our support had gone as far as it could for him. And would he just be at that point turned over to some system or agency or people that I didn't know, and that we weren't able to kind of help Devin work through making a plan with. We had been relying a lot on the relationships that we built over time. And we knew also that we had a good relationship with Devin. And, because there's some fear, I think, for a parent to think about even turning their child over to the supported decision-making process, right? He had to be able to meet with Patty by himself. I was not part of that. His dad wasn't part of that. We needed to let him speak and learn on his own. And again, we kind of always fell back on knowing that we had worked really hard to build a good relationship with Devin, and that, we made ourselves available for communication, continued to show that we cared and were interested. And, that really saw us through. So we never felt like we were not involved at all. We just knew that our role was now different and we were needing to learn to interact with him in a different way as he came into his adulthood. And I have to say that that's one of the best things that happened as a parent, was to really see him come into his own and realize it was like a light bulb went off. And he said, I am a decision maker. Because as he said to you, he never really felt like he was making decisions, even when we were putting him at a table saying, hey, you're here with us now, you're equal. He never saw himself that way. And we could see progressively as he was having the meetings with Patty that he was engaging with us more in terms of talking about what he wanted to do in his future, what his dreams were, what he hoped for himself, thinking about different options. He just never used to really engage in future thinking. And all of a sudden he was. And I do believe that it's because he was treated different through the process of the facilitation, but he was also taught what decision making is about. He was taught you can make a choice, and here's some of the areas that you'll probably need to make choices in. Let's think about what kind of decisions you might need to make, and let's also think about what goes into a good decision. So as opposed to just sitting him at a table, he was being given the skills over time, easily digestible. It went at his pace. There were times where it went forward and then it took 10 steps back because Devin needed to rethink about some things, needed to, process it a little bit more. So we had to follow his lead on that. But he was given the skills to see himself differently. And that was so exciting for us as a parent to have that happen. And I have to say that as a parent, that also gives us peace of mind, both my husband and I, because he's been taught skills around, these are safety skills, right? Whether, Devin is living in an apartment with support in Albany. Prior to that, he was living in OPWDD certified housing with more supports. And, whatever his life, would take him, to be taught, how to look around, be observant, ask ask questions, think things through, get support, reach out. Those are essential safety skills that, you know, if he had a guardian and people were just kind of counting on, you know, well, there's a guardian who's going to decide for him and will keep him safe. One, if, you know, if I had been appointed as guardian, I wouldn't be with him 24/7 to know what's going on. And we probably would not have thought to like instill that skill set in him. And so we sleep a little bit better at night knowing that he's been taught some of these things. The other thing that it did, and I'll wrap up after this, but, you know, is that we did have a supportive network of friends and family that were around us. And we had people that always cared about Devin, always were asking about Devin, you know, wanted to know what, you know, was happening, cheering him on. But this gave an opportunity for all of us to think about that network differently, us as his parents, Devin, and the people that are in that network as his supporters, because you know, there, as part of this process, Devin needed to go to these people and say, hey, this is something I'm doing. I'm working on the supported decision-making agreement. I know that I'm going to need to have a team around me that I can call on, you know, to talk things through, help me research, help me, you know, weigh the pros and cons. And you know what? I'd like you to be on that team. And I've really given some thought. And I know that you're really good. You own your own business. So I think you'd be really great at helping me think about employment opportunities. You know, so he showed that he had given some thought to this, and the honor that people had in Devin asking them to be a member of his team and to, you know, these documents, it was notarized, there was a big ceremony. So these people that we knew who cared about him now came around in a much different way, and they feel differently about their role. You know, they've signed on in a beautiful ceremony to say, I'm going to be there for Devin. And thankfully, he's got 11 people. So we kind of structured, you know, we were talking a little bit to Devin about some of the people that were around, and he's got people who are like 30 years younger than his mom and dad who are part of his supported, you know, his support network, his supporters. And that's wonderful, right? Because again, we're not going to be here forever, and it can change over time. And as more people come into his life, and maybe there's more new family members, and he can be constantly adding to that, so that we know, you know, that when something happens to us, there's this beautiful network of support and people that have stepped up and wanting to be part of Devin's lives. And he knows them, most importantly, and he trusts them, and he's worked with them. So, I mean, it really, really, it just, you know, it made such a difference to all of us. And again, I think to the supporters as well. And so, you know, what we've seen happen with those supporters is that people who always would direct questions to Mark or I, his dad and myself, they now reach out to Devin directly because they know, like, I have this open invitation. Devin has asked me to be part of his life. And so people are following up with him and wanting to know what he's doing. And, you know, just, you know, our use of the agreement to this date has been rather informal. He's got a lot of things going on in his life with being part of the transitions program at Lexington ARC and doing the stuff he's doing at SUNY and moving into the apartment. And, you know, so we're all just kind of watching that. He's had a couple of decisions that he's run past some people to talk to them about it. But I just see that there's this engagement with him that didn't, like, directly with him and him directly with his supporters that did not exist before. And I think, you know, will, you know, work really, you know, really well for him long term. So we just are so excited to be a part of it, and we're so excited about, you know, the legislation and, you know, kind of seeing where this goes as we, you know, get to this point where these agreements are more legally recognized, and, you know, starting to make sure that we're part of educating, you know, the financial industry, the doctors, the educators, you know, as to what these agreements are about, how they can be used to successfully support somebody, and are thrilled for the opportunity, you know, that Devin's had in this program. Thankful to Patty and Helen and everybody who's done any work on, you know, bringing this opportunity you know, forth. And final thing I keep saying is that putting my parent to parent hat on, you know, we are very supportive of supported decision making because, you know, Halden showed that spectrum, you know. one size fits all doesn't work. It just doesn't. We really truly believe in choice, and having a lot of different supports that are available and letting people choose what's right for them. Clearly, you know, Devin feels this is what's right for him, and we are here to support him in that. But we do also recognize there's always going to be folks who are going to need a guardianship, and you know, that option needs to be there as well. And I think Samantha is going to talk. I'll hand over to Samantha, because I think she's going to talk a little bit about how the two concepts, you know, might work together effectively also. So I'll turn over to Samantha now.
No, thank you though, Michelle. That was great. And Devin too, because you know, just listening to you, what an incredible experience you all have had, along with Patty's assistance, you know, in going through this. So I'm sure there'll be some questions that we all want to ask afterwards. So we'll let Samantha now share her story a little bit with us. Thank you.
So as Michelle mentioned, I approach this from a bit of a different perspective, and I will be speaking more about guardianship because my two younger siblings, we have known from the time my mom adopted my little brother and from fairly soon after she adopted my little sister that they would need guardianships because of the extent of their needs and their capabilities. And I think something that doesn't get discussed enough is how difficult it is to come to terms with that, because you have these tiny people that you love with your whole heart and they're the center of your world. And as they grow, they develop some skills, and I will talk about those as well. But there are things that it's recognizing, okay, so this skill set that we thought might develop is not going to be able to develop. This level of independence will not be able to be reached. And there can be a lot of frustration. And part of why I was so happy to be on this panel is because I haven't felt this frustration in these dialogues, but there can be a lot of shame associated with that, and people telling parents that the way you're handling this is not appropriate, and pursuing a guardianship is you're depriving your child of something. And I do think that that's worth discussing. And I think parents need to be more educated that it's not just about, as a parent, you're retaining the rights that you've had for your child's whole life. You are depriving them of something, but it goes back to that spectrum that I was happy Halden put on the screen of autonomy to protection. And I think there's a risk of de-emphasizing protection and overemphasizing autonomy, especially when that autonomy is not really meaningful in cases where someone has the level of disability that, you know, for example, my siblings have. If we were to execute an agreement, it would result in a de facto guardianship. It would be, we are making decisions because I could sit my little brother down for hours. He wouldn't tolerate it, but I could try to sit him down for hours and explain, this is why you need a hip surgery. This is why your doctor wants you to have hip surgery. This is what you're going through right now. This is what you'll go through if you don't have it. And we would never reach a level where he is able to meaningfully make a decision. So as supporters, because of his communication barriers, we would be in charge of communicating that, okay, this is what Ty has said he wants, but that wouldn't be genuine. And I don't think that that can be described as meaningful autonomy. But I think that there are ways to maximize the autonomy that a person can have based on their abilities. You know, with both of my siblings, neither of them are 18 yet. My little sister is 11, my little brother's 13. So we've got a few more years, and it's very exciting to see what skills they will develop and what independence they will be able to have within a guardianship structure. But my little sister, she picks her own clothes, which, you know, that's fun. It's fun to see her develop that. My little brother decides what he wants to eat, if he wants to be in his chair, in his hospital bed, in the bed in his room. And these might sound like small decisions, but they weren't able to make these decisions a few years ago. And the skills that we're instilling in them to make these small decisions, it would be wonderful if someday it could be applied on a larger scale. And if there were choices about like education, right now they go to different specialized schools. We thought maybe they need a break from each other during the day. But if they want to stay in these programs, or if there's a different one that might be a better fit. You know, if we could ever reach that point, that would be wonderful. But guardianship provides a very effective safety net in the event that that never gets reached, because when they turn 18, they both also have a lot of medical conditions in addition to being intellectually and developmentally disabled. And having guardianship as, okay, we will always have this to fall back on, so that they have access to government benefits, they have access to medical care. They both are enrolled in OPWDD in various capacities, and they won't lose those services because there's no one to direct the self-directed program. But I think the key to all of it is education, is educating guardians that just because you are given a full guardianship, you can allow your child or other family member to continue to make the decisions that they can make. And some surrogates will carve that out specifically. I'm lucky enough to be interning with Judge Pettit of Surrogates Court in Albany County, and I've sat in on a number of 17As at this point. It's my favorite part of the job. And she will tell guardians that if there's a decision that your usually child, sometimes sibling, can make, that allow them to make it. You know, if there's a very pressing safety concern, if it's a decision beyond their capability, then that's a different story, and that needs to be handled differently. And that's where the guardianship authority comes in. But just because you have a safety net beneath you doesn't mean that you have to use it. And I think if parents were made more aware of that, the whole process would be, I guess, less and more scary in some ways. Less scary because, okay, I'm not doing this thing that everyone is telling me is so horrible. More scary because, as you know, Michelle and Devin spoke about, your kids are going to make decisions you don't agree with. I am not intellectually developmentally disabled. My mom is on this call. She could attest. I make decisions she doesn't agree with every single day, because that's just part of interpersonal relationships. And this is something Erica and I have talked about, that there needs to be more training done for guardians who aren't corporate guardians, and for family members to understand what's being gained and what's being taken away. And that supported decision-making for the people that it's appropriate for is an excellent alternative, but for the people it's not appropriate for, the principles of respecting the dignity of the person you're given authority over, and the preferences that they're able to understand and express, and understand the consequences of expressing, because that's another very significant part of it. My little brother has things that he loves and he would do all day, every day if he could. But when we ask him, do you understand why you can't do this? He either doesn't answer, or he laughs at me, or he shakes his head no. And that response is going to be his response even as he ages out of being considered a child. Yeah, so it's about educating people, and educating people subject to guardianships to the extent appropriate.
Thank you. Thank you, Samantha. That was great. And I think you really offer a very realistic view of, guardianship versus, talking about, the need to not necessarily protect, but to provide a safety net, the checks and balances, so to speak, but also along the way teaching about decision-making and offering any opportunity to learn and to become more empowered to live a self-directed life. And I think that's what you're looking at as well. I know when we first started chatting about that, I said another person that I could talk to about this, because
Absolutely.
it's been very hard. I've read so many articles on supported decision-making, and I'll be honest about that. It's very oriented to the academicians and not to the practitioners or the people that live it every day, and the people that have the living experiences and I think, we have a lot to learn from. So I think what you've done is just kind of balance that a little bit with, and what Michelle has said also, it's not for everyone. It's not a cookie cutter type of thing, that there are different needs and different strengths and different ways to support people on a continuum. That continuum is really important. And I think you're right about people shouldn't look down or look up to people. I think that we learn from one another about what is successful, what works for you may not work for somebody else. And I think Devin, I think you're extraordinary. I love this story so much. I think you, the three of you, Patty and Devin and Michelle, and also Samantha and Paul, you could do like a whole routine of educating people, because you really have such a wonderful approach to things. And I just like to start off by asking a question, if that's okay. And just what happens now? Devin is so lucky to have 11 supporters. What happens when someone doesn't have all those supporters around them? What happens when they have nobody, in fact, to be able to select from? And, what happens with that? And any one of you folks on the panel can jump in.
Well, I know from my experience, I did, facilitate with 2 other individuals as well, and went through the whole process with them. And, initially with meeting with the decision maker, it would take, several meetings to really kind of get a sense of, who this person is, and, talking about, family, and if there is family or a close relative or friends, even, it doesn't necessarily have to be family. I know that there have been others, not in my situation, but, through the whole training process, every month I would have a meeting with a mentor. Okay. And I had someone that I could go to as a facilitator when questions or concerns came up and challenges I really didn't know how to deal with, and got some advice from others throughout the state as well that were part of this pilot. And, and I still struggle with those individuals who don't have family and have chosen staff that to be their supporters. And I don't know, I'm not totally and this is again, just me, I wasn't totally really on board with having staff. And it's only because, that person may be very much involved with that person right then and there, or part of their, support team. But if they leave, are they still going to be involved as much as they are now? So and I know people have chosen staff as supporters. So I'm not sure. That's just my own view. But you can choose whoever you want, as a decision maker, who's going to be your supporter.
If I could add
Thank you. Yeah.
a little something to that. I mean, I agree with what Patty is saying for sure. And I think in my experience, there certainly are people who, I think, broadly speaking, social capital is extremely valuable, right, in this world. And it's something that that not everybody has. So I think that there are situations certainly where people in this position may choose, for instance, staff, or I've experienced people choosing former staff that they had developed relationships with. But I think that also speaks to one of the roles that a facilitator can play. And I think Patty was sort of getting at this, is trying to imagine who in one's life could potentially be a supporter, and also to what Michelle mentioned earlier, that even a relationship that may not be familial or close like that can be strengthened by the opportunity or the question, right? Being asked to support someone in a specific area of one's life can build social capital. And I think that goes for staff members too, that a particular staff member, let's say at an OPW facility, may have a relationship with someone who's exploring SDM, but by that person asking them to support them in this way, that can help strengthen that relationship and build that relationship. And certainly we have a lot of people in our system who retired or former staff members, they already outside of the context of SDM offer to be advocates or want to maintain relationships with people for whom they used to be staff. And so I think that's certainly one opportunity. But I think also, Patty mentioned friends, and I think it's important to mention that there's no preclusion against, for instance, someone who lives in a group home whose friends are for the most part people who also have disabilities. There's no reason why somebody with a disability can't be a supporter for somebody with a disability, right? Everyone's different. Everybody's got different perspectives and different capabilities, and so one can also get a lot of support from someone else who may themselves have challenges with decision making. That doesn't mean that two people working together can make better decisions. I think the idea is really what I'm getting at is that a facilitator can hopefully help that process along a little bit and help someone figure out who they may have, even if they have a sense themselves that they may not have people in their lives.
And I would just encourage families that are, early in this process, that you're not facing 18, next year, but you're thinking, you're starting to think about this. Families and the providers, that provide services to individuals, to really give thought to that early on. We talk about community integration. It's really important to have our sons and daughters as members in the community in places that aren't always disability specific. Have them known, to people at your church, your husband's Rotary Club, your, whatever it might be. Make those connections, make them visible, make people aware, have them know the stories, because those are the people that you can end up, kind of drawing upon. And you're kind of reminding me, long time ago, Devin was very, very little, and his brother, I don't even know, Devin might not have been even school age at the time, but his brother was at a school, and I'd go and pick up. I'd be standing, in the parking lot waiting to pick up, didn't take the bus home. And there was this one woman there who'd always say, "How's Devin doing?" And she'd ask me, he had a lot of health issues at the time. And we were looking desperately to fill some consumer directed personal care hours. And it can be hard as parents to ask for help or to make those conversations known. But one day I was like, she asks you all the time, why don't you say to her, hey, I actually have this opportunity, and, would you be interested in, working with Devin, giving us a few hours of a break? And guess what? She did. And she still follows Devin's story to this day. And again, he wasn't even in kindergarten when this happened. So it can be hard as families to ask and be thinking out of the box. Sometimes we feel, like we put it all upon ourselves, but be reaching out, be looking, and be looking for those opportunities to make connections for your sons and daughters. And or if you're a provider, community integration is really important. It isn't just something that, it's the right thing to do and we have to check off that we did it, but really it also increases safety, I believe, for people when they're known and they're a part of their community. So it's really critical.
Yeah.
If I can add to,
go ahead.
If I could add to that, I think that it's crucial, even if you won't be pursuing SDM and you know that guardianship is the route that you want to take, because as a future co-guardian, because my mother and I will be co-guardians of both of my siblings, it's such a weight off my shoulders. And I know that I'll be able to do a better job because my mom has such a network of supporters and we have family all over who will help. And both of the kids are, so known at the church that my mom goes to. And if they're not there, everyone asks, where's Ty? It was so quiet today, because he wasn't saying he was all done. So no matter which route you're taking, it's so important to have people to support both your loved one and yourself as a supporter or guardian, because, I think it's not something that gets talked about as much as it should, because it's frowned upon, but it's challenging. It's the most rewarding thing I've ever done, to be helping out with my siblings, but it can be very difficult, and having people around you who value you and your loved ones eases the burden so much, and it makes you a better supporter or guardian.
Well said. Well said, both of you. Really wonderful. I was just going to read a couple of the questions that we have in the chat. And one of the questions from Eileen: how consistent were his, I think it was Devin's supporters And were there supporters who dropped out? And if so, how did you handle that? So that's for, I guess, Devin and for Michelle. Did you have did you have problems with some of the supporters in terms of showing up when you needed them?
No, because half of them were like my family and half of them were some of my dad's friends. So like none of them have dropped out. Actually all of them are still my supporters.
What would you do, Devin, if somebody had to drop out? How do you think, what would you?
Find a replacement.
So we would talk about it, right? You would probably work with the remaining supporters and kind of, because you have 11, I think the one thing would be, do we need somebody else? You have a lot, right? But you know, probably have a conversation a little bit about that. But yeah, no, people have been really, really good, as I said, really, really owning the role and checking in with him. So we have not experienced that, but I think, you know, conversation and relationships do a lot for solving any kind of problems. And I think that's what we would rely on.
Okay, well, that's great. We have another question from Catherine. Michelle spoke, or we weren't sure if it was Michelle or Patty, of Devin's declining recommended dental treatment. Suppose the procedure or treatment needed involved something life-threatening or significantly negative for the future. Would Devin still have had the authority with supporters to make his own decision? As a person without intellectual or developmental disabilities, would not to have the treatment procedure?
Yeah. You know, my dad right now is undergoing some pretty significant medical treatment and making some decisions that are hard for us to live with. I think that our choices, you know, our preference would always be that Devin make the choices and be involved and hopefully work through his supported decision-making agreement to get some advice. He's got some great medical people that are part of his team, you know, and that would be our wish, is that he be able to make those decisions. There can be times where people choose something differently than you would choose for yourself. And, you know, it's one of life's hardest lessons, right? To stand by somebody when that is happening. I do think it's important, though, because at the heart of this, every mom or dad or family caregiver of any variety has fear, right? You love these people and you're worried and you're scared that, again, I literally, you know, spent most of Devin's childhood keeping him alive, right? So the thought of him making a decision medically that would not be something I agree with would be really, really difficult. I do think it's important for folks to know that just because you've gone through the supported decision-making agreement, if someone started making really reckless decisions that, you know, you really didn't feel that they were informed and considered and just, you know, their choice, but that there was something was impacting their ability to really go through the decision-making process in a healthy, you know, again, informed way, there's nothing that precludes you from seeking, you know, ethics committee to get involved if there's a hospital, or ultimately seeking a guardianship at some point down the line if somebody's really endangering themselves. So it's not it can change, like we've talked about, the supported decision-making agreement can change, but so can, you know, the circumstances around it. And you always have a choice of seeking something that would be more restrictive if you felt that you needed to do that as a family member.
Good. Yeah, there's flexibility.
Yeah,
and I think that's important.
Yeah, and you know, the other thing that I think is good about having this team that's around Devin is that, you know, if I don't, and it just might be me, but I know the guardianship situations that I know, it's usually one person, maybe a backup guardian, it's maybe a couple siblings. It's usually a small group, right, that's functioning as that. You know, there's a big group, you know, that's around Devin. There's people that have their eyes on him and are invested in him in a different way. And I think that it also helps do a little bit of checks and balances, you know, that any one member of the supporting group doesn't like overstep their bounds as the supporter, you know, and or to the reverse are also concerned about his safety. So if they felt like this really isn't working and he's not safe, there's a whole network of people around him that are looking, you know, for that and can throw those red flags if need be. Whereas if I had been named as guardian, those people probably wouldn't say too much, right? Because, well, she's legally the guardian, not much that I can say, but people are invested in his safety and well-being, which I think helps, put again, a network of safety around him.
Yeah.
If I
Thank
could
you.
also just add to that, I mean, I think Michelle, you bring up a really good point there at the end, especially that even in the context of guardianship, a guardian, especially a 17A guardian, has pretty broad authority, but it's not the same thing as compelling someone to do something against their will, right? And so there's still always going to be tension in that respect, especially when somebody who has a guardian can also speak for themselves. So when you have somebody who, for instance, is using SDM, and then maybe the kind of situation like you're describing, Michelle, happens where later a parent or a loved one feels that guardianship is necessary and perhaps later gets a guardianship. There are lots of nuances here, and there's still a level of communication and convincing, so to speak, that would need to go into making something like that happen, because refusing medical treatment is not as simple as having a guardian or not, right? A guardian can consent to medical treatment, but that doesn't mean it happens. If somebody, it's not the same as compulsion. So I also think it is important to bring up the idea of how a tailored guardianship can coexist with SDM, right? Which is not something we've talked about a lot today, but I think is really important to the premise of the session, which is an Article 81 guardianship, or to the degree that a judge is willing, a tailored 17A guardianship, even though, as we discussed in the last session, that's not always considered possible. But in a situation like what was being described here, if somebody has an SDMA and then appears to be making what looks like a very reckless medical decision, and later that comes in front of the court in the context of a guardianship proceeding, the court would have the opportunity to say, okay, this person, let's say John Doe, does appear to need more support in the context of medical decision making, and we do want to appoint a guardianship there. But there's no indication that they've made any reckless decisions or done anything. There's no evidence to support a guardianship in other areas of that person's life. And this SDMA that they have stretches much more broadly than medical decision making. So there's a perfect example of how they can quite literally and legally coexist at the same time, that you could have a tailored guardianship that covers one area or some areas of a person's life, and an SDMA that covers others, and both of those would have legal effect. And so the guardian wouldn't be able to act in those situations in the stead of the individual in the areas that the SDMA covered, but would be able to act in the areas where the guardianship covered. So I think it's just important. There are lots of different constellations that can exist here,
Right.
different versions of guardianship and SDMA at the same time.
But excuse me if I may, isn't that really what we're hearing? And we're hearing it, I think I've been hearing it in one form or another all day, which is that when we're discussing the lives of specific individual people, which is what we are discussing here, very specific, very individual people, isn't it always in the nuance, in the complexities? And I think, unfortunately, we live in a world in which we'd like to be able to put everything into category A, category B, category C, and you either fit here or here or here. And that isn't always so. I mean, Holden, to use your example, yes, you could be in a situation where someone declines needed medical treatment, life-saving medical treatment. And I suppose it is possible that could end up back in front of the court in a guardianship proceeding. The guardianship proceeding might very well be totally irrelevant because the person who declined the treatment might be gone. So, I mean, it's not so.
I agree.
simple.
I agree, Catherine. I think that's absolutely true. And I think that's true outside of the context of supported decision-making, right? That's really true in
life. It's out of the,
exactly. That's true in life. And I think is sort of another example of the fact that guardianships are not always a particularly appropriate tool in a situation like that, because they, for one thing, may not be speedy enough to respond. And so in some cases, families or loved ones may predict a situation like that and may seek to have a guardianship beforehand for their loved one. But in many situations, one doesn't do that. And even in those situations where one may have predicted or be worried about a situation like that, unless there's really evidence to show that that is likely, a court may well deny a guardianship, right? So, it's
Yes.
exactly as you say, it's life. Like,
But the other thing I think that we have to recognize, and I think we sometimes get lost in all the discussion about who can make decisions and who can be a supporter and who can, all of that, all of which is very important in the cases for which it's appropriate for it to be applied. There is a significant population within the IDD community for whom that is simply not really an issue. It may be an issue in terms of simple decisions. I like hot dogs or I don't like hot dogs. And that you don't need to even have words to let people know. But it is not necessarily applicable in significant complex decisions and how they get made. So, I mean, I think that's another, you have the vertical and the horizontal. And I think we have to recognize that all of those are there. And that we're always dealing with specific individuals with specific abilities and specific inabilities, if we can use that term.
Well, I don't know if anyone wants to say any closing remarks. I don't know if we went through all of the questions here or not, but it is the end. We could keep going if you wanted to, but
Well, let me just say, Eric, others may have questions and I'm happy to hear them, obviously.
yeah.
But let me just say that I've found the entire day very, very interesting and thought-provoking. I do not feel at the end of the day that I have hard and fast answers to a lot of the questions that we've discussed today, but I feel it's been very worthwhile discussion, and I'm most grateful to the panelists now, to Devin, to his mom, to Patty, to who's the young woman? Samantha, talking about her brother. Sorry, Samantha, I apologize. Chalk it up to old age. But also I commend you, Erica, for really being the organizer here, and your committee from the Guardianship Committee that helped you put all this together, and Angel, of course, who is the detail person. So I just think it's been a terrific terrific morning and afternoon, and I look forward to tomorrow morning.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Catherine. And thank you all again for participating today. It was wonderful. I think we have, you're great mentors. I think, I know that the Parent to Parent of New York State is like a mentoring type of thing also. And if you could tape this, this conversation and allow people to, hear some of the pros and the cons and some of the things so that people can be educated. This was just a wonderful way of doing it, I think. So thank you again. Thank you, Halden, for setting the stage for us, and Patty and Samantha. Really, you guys are wonderful. And Devin, of all, you are wonderful. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot from you today. So, and I know everyone else has too. So thank you for being part of this.
I told them professional headshots are next.
Oh, yes, there you go. There you go. All
Yeah.
right, everyone. We will see you back tomorrow morning. We're done for the day, and I know that we all need a rest. I know our backs need a rest, and I hope you have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you back tomorrow. Take care.
Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.